Well, welcome back. Thank you for joining us for part two of a virtual discussion we've got entitled Fundraising East and West, Trends, Motivations, and Practical Insights from US and Asia. And as I said earlier, this was really fueled by some interesting online discussion and also by my colleagues Heather and Peter having conversations about it. So in the earlier session, we covered understanding regional giving cultures and practical fundraising approaches. And in this session, we're going to ask some conversations or questions around building relationships across borders, regulation, risk, and practicalities, and future trends. So all three of us currently work for the Philanthropy Company. We're one of the more established consultancies with a genuinely global footprint. We were founded by Caroline Underwood around about 25 years ago. We work right across the charitable landscape, from education, including university schools, to arts, heritage, culture, health, into international NGOs and more. And our team covers the full spectrum of leadership and fundraising, including campaigns, endowment, coaching, interim support, messaging, leadership, international strategy. And what we think sets us apart are our people, that we bring recent hands-on experience from major charities. We work really as an extension of your team, not just producing a report that sits in your shelf, but delivering practical work you can implement and supporting you through the journey. So I'm Gordon Cox. I'm a director of the educational team. I've worked for 6 universities. I'm a human geographer and a hobby traveller, fundraised around the world in many regions. Heather and Peter, both also fantastic experience. Heather originally from the US, a dual British American citizen. She's brought transformational gifts from three continents and worked for many institutions. Peter, most recently, was the director at Fitzwilliam in Cambridge, but has also held the portfolio of Asia at Imperial. So we're going to cover a great cross section today of global fundraising as we look to address fundraising East-West, trends, motivations, and practical insights from US and Asia. So thank you for joining us. So I'm going to move over to the first questions of this session. So Peter and Heather, we'll start with Peter. Peter, how important is senior level involvement when engaging donors in these regions?
Thank you, Gordon. It's very important. It's also very important to know when to bring in that senior level engagement, which varies. If you're engaging a senior donor, you would ideally want your senior leader to ask that senior donor for support. But this varies. I think in the US, as Heather talked about in part one, your big philanthropists and senior donors expect a meeting with your senior leader to be asked and to make a gift. In an Asian context, that might vary slightly. You might be expected to reposition the way you work. So to give a worked example from real life, in one of my previous roles, we had a donor who'd given seven-figure sums to the organisation and wanted to make a large seven-figure gift. We had to work quite closely at a mid-level, us as fundraisers, with the director of that individual's foundation, who had been working as a company secretary for them for about 40 years. And that was really key because really that individual was the person doing a lot of the negotiation and liaison with the donor. And the reason we did that was because this donor obviously wanted to keep a sense of pride that when they met the senior leader, they knew exactly what was coming and were in a position to say yes. So yes, in that context, we did want the senior leader to have that engagement, but it wasn't necessarily viewed that whenever they met the senior leader, there would be an ask or there would be a gift, but certainly that whenever they met the senior leader, we were able to go through that intermediary and always make sure that that senior donor knew exactly what was coming and that for them there was no risk of them being caught off guard or any risk of them not being able to kind of respond to the context and the content of the meeting. So it's very important, but I also just add that it's important to know as well what our relationships are as fundraisers with different partners and to ensure that we really position ourselves as best we can when working in different cultures.
And Heather, what's your take on that question?
Yeah, so there's a lot that Peter says that resonates. I think that's similar in the US. I mean, the importance of senior leadership, it's fundamental. But as Peter rightly points out, how you bring in your senior leader and when is really important and understanding the nuance. So I do think it depends a little bit on the size of the gift. And the way, at least in a US context, I like to think about the fundraiser role is you're essentially an ambassador. And like an ambassador, there will be moments when you are the prime negotiator and you are working through some of the details of the gift arrangement or teeing up a potential ask. Ultimately, the senior donor you're working with expects to see his or her equal, and that is above your pay grade, and as it should be. So never becoming confused about what your role is, even when sometimes you're doing a lot of the heavy lifting and negotiating directly with the donor. The other thing is that you do need to be prepared to not mind feeling like you've been slightly demoted, perhaps, because as the gift size gets bigger, they will bring in more advisors of their own, and now you need to kind of man mark the advisor, perhaps, and run two channels of communication. And yes, you're probably planning quite a lot of what your senior leader might say, but you need to be okay with and comfortable with taking that slightly secondary position when it arrives. So I think just being nimble is really important to get the tone right.
Yeah, if I can just add one thing, Heather, which I thought I just mentioned here too, it varies across different cultures and contexts in Asia. And your little analogy there of man marking just made me think of my one experience working with donors based in South Korea. And it was like kind of, the full NFL kind of lineup ahead of everything kicking off, in that you had about 10 of us, each kind of man marking a different person. There was an expectation on their side that only people of the right level would talk to people of the right level. And it was so hierarchical and so confusing. You did need a tactics book and a playbook there. In other contexts in mainland China, I've seen a great degree of kind of freedom and freewheeling for senior people to want to speak with more junior fundraisers and to just take the time because they're passing through. And that can vary. So there's no one answer to that across entire cultures, but certainly as the seniority of the individual, size of gift, and the complexity of that grows, it should be expected that we should respond.
That was great. Thank you. So my next question is really for Peter. What roles do networks, alumni, and their communities play in opening doors?
Thanks, Gordon. It's interesting. It varies. I would say that I'll cover each of these, I suppose, separately, if that's okay to approach a question. So in terms of networks are really useful, especially when working overseas. The chances are that individuals who are based in those other countries can be useful intermediaries. They can signpost you. Depending on what that depending on what that network is and how you choose to leverage, it can be really important. So I would think firstly in your network, what role do you want people to play there? Do you want them to help make introductions to people? Do you want them to just signpost you and to teach you more? What's their value to you? In terms of thinking about alumni or groups who, in the non-education context, have been members, for example, of that organization, I think a really interesting thing to think about is the particular dynamic of the group within the culture you're in. I think all of us who've worked in universities have worked with regional alumni groups where some are fantastic, they're brilliant, others are not the right people always, in thinking about fundraising to represent you to those senior donors. So always think to yourself, who are the alumni you know and would like to speak with, and don't necessarily always just think that because you have a network or a group, it's going to be able to deliver or be the right vehicle for the particular philanthropist you're approaching. With regards to the diaspora, it's a really interesting piece, and obviously different diasporas exist in different contexts. I know global and international fundraisers, for example, whose roles have been focused around the geography and the diaspora, with the expectation that they cover, for example, East Asia and the East Asian diaspora, and would therefore think about their work across areas like the northwest coast of North America, thinking around areas like Vancouver and how they would travel into those areas as well as areas in East Asia and thinking about their work. You'll find families stretched across diasporas. You will have to be able to be intelligent about how you're operating across several cultures sometimes and working with them, but actually engaging with diasporas and understanding in those contexts the way that cultures come together, the way that families and interests move across them and the opportunities that presents can provide a level of sophistication to the approaches you're able to make and the way you're able to unlock gifts. So they're really, really vital. I suppose that would be my short answer there in terms of that. They open doors, but they also facilitate more detailed and meaningful conversations and improve the quality of your work if you're leveraging them correctly.
in a more practical point as well, and a play in the opening doors. I mean, alumni in regions, how often I use them to recommend on venues for events, for meetings, a whole host of things, and often they provide it just by asking for help and an essential volunteer network in regions. Um, Moving on to Heather, and this is more of a cultural question, what regulatory or tax considerations should UK fundraisers be aware of when engaging US donors?
Thanks, Gordon. Yeah, so I'd said at the outset, and I suspect most of the people who are listening to this conversation are aware, at least notionally, about the necessity of having a 501c3 set up to receive gifts and allow donors in the US to get a tax deduction. So I'm not intending to go into any great detail in that, but assuming that you've got that knowledge, one of the things that I think is a really pronounced difference that I wasn't quite expecting when I first came in 2008 to fundraise in the UK from the US is the vast majority of our major gifts in the US came in the form of shares. So there's a really significant difference because, of course, it feels for many donors, I think, a lot less painful to make a big commitment by using a share gift. Share transfer, first of all, is very easy. It doesn't feel like it's come out of cash. Second of all, there's the cherry on top in that they're avoiding capital gains tax. So there's this additional benefit. But the facility, the ease of them making transfers like this in the US is considerable. It's a bit clunky here in the UK still. It's not as common. So I think it's really useful for UK fundraisers to be aware of that because it might help you to feel a little bit more confident that gifts of a certain size are really relatively very easy to be made and fairly swiftly. There's just, I think if you were aware how they might be making that gift, you'd feel slightly emboldened when you're thinking about the amount and also the potential tax benefits they get. We certainly were inundated with these at the end of every calendar year. So around about just post Christmas, we would have so many that came in. I can't overemphasize so many that came in. We were often chasing ones that inadvertently did not come through with a name. So our financial people would be ringing us going, do you have any idea whose 150 shares of Microsoft this is? So it's a really significant part of the way Americans give. The other thing that I think is really important, obviously I started off life as a planned giving fundraiser, so I was aware of a whole host of tricks and whizzy types of gifts, income generating vehicles that individuals in the US are able to make. Now, those require that for the most part that you are set up to receive them. And I wouldn't necessarily suggest that people organize themselves to do that. It can be quite time consuming, but there are a few that you can benefit from fairly simply, again, as long as you had a 501c3. And just to give you an example, most people, once they're 70 and a half, have to take a distribution from their IRA. And for many years now, they've been able to make those transfers directly to a charitable entity. So it's up to, I think, £111,000 a year they're able to do now. That's fairly significant for most UK charities. That is an easy way for those individuals to be making a gift that's tax efficient for them. And that zips across straight through to you. So awareness of that and the ability to mention that as a suggested possibility is really great. I think there were a few other things I was going to mention, but that's probably more than enough for everyone to be getting on with. But I think that in general, the point would be you have more options as a US donor, and your donors are thinking about that, which pots of money they might use in order to facilitate the gift they want to make to you. Reminding them of them is really helpful.
That's great. And there is a lot to touch on in that point alone. And I remember it was a US donor who taught me about that IRS thing and actually helped us do a mailing to alumni off the back of it as I do. But I mean, it is interesting the difference in UK and possibly US fundraisers over their comfort and financial ability and confidence in talking about things like endowment, tax in the UK, let alone international, and all aspects of finance. So if you get a chance to to build up your confidence and experience in these areas. I strongly recommend it, not just in international, but also in the UK as well. Peter, moving to Asia, are there any structural or legal barriers that make fundraising in Asia more complex?
Yes, I mean, firstly, as I said before, Asia is a very big place with lots of different countries. So that's a lot of different systems, barriers, potential routes to philanthropy to get your head around. I'll focus on a few big things. Firstly, I'll say that, with the US, it's been quite straightforward, as Heather says, that you have a 501c3. It makes it an easy way to receive funds. There is no blanket situation, no blanket mechanism or organizational structure which works for a majority of donors across many of the major philanthropic territories in East Asia. There may be some options that can be explored, but they all have their limitations to donors and therefore don't really tend to drive philanthropy to organisations or are seen as a requisite for them if you're a UK organisation raising that funding internationally. What's, I think, more important is thinking about the actual limitations that donors themselves practically have. So, for example, mainland China has got quite strict capital control rules, which basically stop citizens from taking more than about 50,000 out of the country each year. That's a fairly small sum of money, and if individuals wanted to travel to the UK or to, pay for children's education here, or to, look at investing in property or business dealings, they understandably want to keep that budget for those purposes rather than necessarily to give away philanthropically. So I've often found when you're working with individuals there, it's really key to ask questions early on that might enable you to understand how easy or difficult it will be for them to make a gift. For example, did they move large amounts of capital outside of the country 15 years ago before those capital controls were in place? If they already have a large amount of wealth and it sits outside of mainland China, then that is money which they're able to utilize more freely outside of that capital control. Can also be that individuals who are building companies and looking at selling them, if they're capable of doing that on overseas exchanges or to private investors in certain markets, they can realize the return of that in currencies other than yuan. So I think it's really important to think about that, because if you're able to ascertain those questions from the potential donors you're talking to in those markets, you'll get an idea of whether or not you'll have the flexibility to actually receive the funding and support from them. The final thing I'll say is there often is the old phrase, where there is a will, there is a way. And you will find donors who are able to do that despite all of the barriers there. But that's not normally the default position from which individuals work. I'd also say for anybody engaged in India, for example, you'll find that there is a strong emphasis on trying to set up foundational structures to support overseas within the country, which can be very administrative. And I think it's fair to say that there is capital control there as well, which isn't easy to navigate, but also the bureaucracy and I think the administrative process behind realising gifts to those that can be realised is incredibly taxing. So I suppose my words here would be keep it light, don't overthink it, probably check at an early stage of your donors how straightforward or not it seems to them. And the other thing to remember is we have lots of individuals living in countries who are global citizens. So it may well be that you just start talking to a donor in Hong Kong who happens to be a US citizen as well, who has got significant income in the US, and actually you need to pivot your brain from I'm working through this system into, oh, that's easy, we have a 501c3 here. So I've often found it's useful to always just see if you can understand if the donors have got any UK assets and liabilities and tax positions from which they can easily make a gift, or indeed anything in the US or another market which is perhaps slightly easier to process transactions through.
Thanks, Peter. And these things are always changing. So I recommend for every gift that you bring in from region, you have to double check and don't assume that prior knowledge remains valid the next time a gift comes in. But I do second the point that people pay tax everywhere now, and having that conversation about where do you want to claim tax in the world is quite common, as odd as it might seem. You may not even realize they have any association to a country, but yet alone that they want to pay the gift from that region. So the last part I really want to touch on today is future trends. And just before I touch on that, I want to bring up something maybe I should have said earlier about building relationships across borders. And I know some people joining today might be from not just from education, so working with alumni, it could be from broader charities. But just a passing observation about what's happening in the world just now. And being aware that certainly if you're working for alumni, that when they graduate in their 20s, they're going to live for a long time. In the UK, we're a very stable country where not a great deal happens over a period of 60, 70 years. But 60 years ago, the Vietnamese War was still happening, for example. So these regions are forever changing, and people have a long memory and a long life. So abandoning a region today because of some geopolitical issue could have long-term repercussions on you down the line. So just bear that in mind when you're working with alumni networks and volunteers or in whatever form they come. So I suppose that's a past trend looking to a future trend that's always going to happen in the world. But moving on to an actual future trend for Peter and Heather, what emerging trends in US and Asian philanthropy should UK organizations be preparing for now? And I'm going to start with Heather.
I think the biggest one is that alumni giving is down. It continues to decrease. At the same time that is true, the gift size is increasing across the board. People are experiencing that. So if you look at Princeton, I think their highest level of alumni giving, the highest percentage is 60%. And it's steadily declined and it's now at an 80-year low. But while that is also true, nobody is under the misguided idea that Princeton is struggling to raise philanthropy. They're actually doing extraordinarily well. So while a lot of us came up through fundraising with a kind of 80-20 rule, which was that 80% of your total would come from 20% of the individuals, I'd say what's happening is that it's now more like 95-5. So I think people need to reflect on their overall teams and what their approach is and be mindful that major giving has become even more important. And I think that they can perhaps focus less energy on donor acquisition when it comes to just chasing a number and a high number and trying to hit a particular participation rate, because I think it's mirroring probably in many ways what's happening in the economy. You're seeing a lot of impact on the middle class. There are people we might in the past have asked for a gift of a certain size, and given what their relative salary is like, having stagnated perhaps, they're not likely to be giving in the same level or way that we might have expected them to 20 years ago. So I just think this is something we need to be really alert to. And potentially pivoting and thinking about team size and team responsibilities and where we focus all of our energy.
That's a good point. And Peter, what observations from yourself?
All sorts of trends I could talk about. I think the one I'll talk about is one which was really kind of came to my mind in the fall last week, thinking about some online discussion I'd had. But it's about the intergenerational transfer of wealth, which we're seeing across the world, not just in Asia, but in the UK and the US. But there's a particular flavour of that happening in Asia, which I think is very interesting in terms of the fact that you've had a lot of new wealth creation across the continent over the last 50 to 60 years, perhaps less established wealth beyond that generationally that you may have had in the West. And particularly in places such as mainland China and the Chinese diaspora from mainland China, owing to the demographic situation that was the one-child policy from the late 70s until very recently, you are seeing a huge number of women who are inheriting significant amounts of wealth, more so than you were seeing in the West. So I think actually thinking about that change and understanding how that is being passed down, that will probably change the pool of donors and philanthropists more significantly than perhaps you're going to see in the West in the coming years. So that's a really interesting thing to look at, and I think to watch in terms of philanthropy across Asia as a forthcoming trend.
Thank you. Now, I know there's sessions about philanthropy, but I'm always struck when it comes to student recruitment for schools and universities that 25% of all the school-age children in the world just now live in India alone, which is a fascinating statistic. And a future trend as well, because at some point a large proportion of all the adults will be in India as well already. So, if you're advising a UK charity starting from scratch, where would you tell them to focus first? Heather.
I mean, based on my earlier statements. I suppose I'm coming around to the view that while I once felt you need to start with a smaller gifts and build a big base and move your way up, I just think you kind of want to cut to the middle and major gift program first. Really think about identifying pockets of wealth within your constituency, work out where they are. Think about, as Peter highlighted really helpfully in an earlier section, what about your work is most likely to appeal to those individuals, and start there. I also think in general, just in terms of us all managing, we're all constrained by finances. So I think a kind of wheel and spoke, have hubs of activity that are manageable and where you do have a big enough group, and then build off of that. If you're routinely going to be in New York seeing individuals because you've got a big enough group there, start thinking about how easily you can get to Boston for a big meeting that you're able to get. And it's fine that you don't have other activity there, but it's close enough, your budget can get your senior leader to that spot, or down to Washington, D.C. And I guess anyway, that Peter might say something similar about age, not trying to spread yourself too thin. And so I think it's a piece of work identifying individuals, pockets of wealth, and where you've got that match or alignment between what you're offering and what your activity is.
And Peter, final thoughts and a good way to end.
Final thoughts. So I echo everything Heather says there. I think I would, if I'm going to be a little bit cheeky, I wrote an article about this a few weeks ago on the Philanthropy Company website about establishing international strategy. So I'd say take a look at that. But it's absolutely what Heather said. Think about cutting to the chase, those key markets, not stretching yourself too thin. I mean, in an Asian context, Hong Kong and Singapore are big metropolitan areas with a lot of international links to the UK and significant amounts of wealth. Think about that before trying to do the grand tour and going to every country you can find. Repeat those visits, build that out, and then operate sensibly. So if you're in Singapore and there's something going on in Kuala Lumpur, it's only an hour away. Don't necessarily try and go from Singapore to Kuala Lumpur to Hong Kong to South China to North China to Japan on one trip, because it will be tiring. And yeah, do your own work would be my final piece. So don't just go to the US or to places in Asia because other people are. Sit down, think about your product, think about your market, and then develop your strategy.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Certainly, I found I increased income from global philanthropists, but also decreased my traveling in the process, mainly because I was thoughtful and considerate on how and when I traveled and took leaders, and it didn't decrease the income. Clearly, you want to go abroad, but thinking carefully about the activity. Well, thank you, Heather and Peter, very much for that. That was fascinating. I know we could have talked all day, and we probably will continue. But thank you to everyone else for joining us today. So this was a discussion on fundraising East and West, trends, motivations, and practical insights from USA and Asia. And we tried to touch on regional giving cultures, a bit on practical fundraising approaches, a little bit on building relationships across borders. We touched on regulation, risk, practicalities, and finished off with future trends. I hope you enjoyed. Please do reach out if you have any questions, and we hope to maybe do some of these sessions in the future. So we hope you can join us for future conversation. Thank you.